even if America got like every single point that it wants, getting an agreement with Iran right now would be a catastrophe.
Don't. Like, what kind of a message is that? Whereas we're sat here going, we're going to bomb you.
Hello and welcome back to The Deep Dive. I'm your host, Jacob Lasnik, and I'm so excited to be back. After over a month of some ballistic missile-related complications, we're finally able to film another episode here in the studio. The US and Iran are in the middle of this amorphous 2-week ceasefire period trying to figure things out, and no one's sure how it's going to go. So we're going to take a closer look. Here to join us is our news editor, Alex Winston. Alex Winston, glad to have you back.
Thank you for having me back.
So it's been a while.
Certainly has.
You know, we've been a bit busy trying not to get blown up and stuff, but you know, it feels good to be able to actually talk. So yeah, let's unpack a bit. I think we have a lot to go over. I think first of all, it would be important to notice that earlier this week, Israel woke up to a different siren. There was International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and while obviously it's a very somber and heavy day, it's kind of relieving to see Israel kind of go back to what we can call normalcy. And, seeing that, we have the space to, dedicate time to all these kinds of ceremonies and, in a way, go back to business as usual. So I think in that sense, we can really say like the war has wound down, that we're able to really.
Absolutely. No, listen, we had, obviously, Pesach was hectic. We were still, there were still missiles firing the last day of the festival, so the ceasefire. And then since then, slowly but surely, as you said, we've been kind of getting back to normal. Kids are going back to school, people are going back to their offices. Obviously, fewer and fewer sirens. The north is still suffering from Hezbollah, but in terms of Iran, as you said, we're sort of getting back to normal, and it's a bit strange. I've seen a lot of comments from people saying, I don't understand Israelis, how they managed to go through 6 weeks of what they went through and then just flip back the next morning, like everything's normal, hunky-dory, can go back to normal life. But it's good that we're back. Obviously, the days, Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaShoah, Yom HaTzmaut, we're leading up to those after Passover, our Independence Day, Holocaust Remembrance Day. Yeah, it's nice that for this Holocaust Remembrance Day, as I said, the kids were able to be in school and learn about it. We had ceremony earlier this week at Mount Herzl,
right?
The state ceremony, and Yad Vashem and the Knesset also held. And it's nice to sort of, be getting back into the swing of things.
Not that International Holocaust Remembrance Day is a normal day, but at least we were able to commemorate it normally.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I guess the next natural question is, how long will this normalcy last? At the time of recording, we're still in between this 2-week ceasefire, which the stated goal is to eventually reach a permanent ceasefire, which would mean the end of conflict between the U.S. and Israel and Iran. And the question on everyone's mind is this going to last? Now, I don't know about you, I'm very confused, because from the get-go, the ceasefire was very shaky, and there's just a lot of elements of it that don't make any sense. As in, there's the strikes on Lebanon issue, there's the fact that the Islamabad talks went really poorly, and they're talking about now that they might revive talks Friday or Sunday this day, but the clock is ticking, and we're slowly approaching the end of these 2 weeks with nothing concrete to show for it. So
absolutely. Well, it's fascinating. I mean,
nothing to show for it. As in, hostilities have stopped between the U.S. and Israel and Iran, but bar that, no concrete
settlement. It hasn't been settled, the issue. I mean, it's fascinating what's going on. Obviously, first and foremost, we're very happy that there were no more missiles falling on the country, and we're not running to bomb shelters, every few minutes. It's certainly been a hectic period for us here in Israel, but I think we need to look at it. What were the goals at the beginning? The stated goals at the beginning of the war. What was the situation when the ceasefire was called? Why was the ceasefire called? Obviously there was so much focus on the Straits of Hormuz and trade and oil and the economy, the economical side of things, that I think has definitely obviously been much more of a focus for the US.
Yeah.
We've heard Trump talk about Hormuz a lot more than Netanyahu. We've heard him talk about oil a lot more than Netanyahu, and about those facets of the war. Whereas Israel's military goal, or stated military goal, was to help the Iranian people and to reduce, obviously, Iran's capabilities, in terms of internal repression, but also, as we know, its nuclear capabilities and everything that we've been talking about for decades nearly. Exactly. So the ceasefire came in, and obviously we've discussed this ad nauseum, also last week on the pod. But right now, the Islamabad talks failed, which I don't think was a surprise to anybody.
No.
There's rumours and reports from Tuesday from earlier this week that they're going to restart talks in Islamabad again. Me personally, understanding the regime, it's playing into their hands kind of thing. Like this, the regime are experts.
I totally agree.
The regime
Yeah.
have been through this so many times, obviously most notably 2015 with the JCPOA, but the regime knows how to...
I would argue also in June was kind of a similar playbook.
Absolutely, but this regime knows how to survive. It knows how to cling on with its bare fingernails and bide time and somehow scrape through with a ceasefire, with a deal or something. It knows how to play the game. It's been playing this game for 5 decades. So a lot of people are looking at it going, even sitting down with the regime is a failure, is a loss.
Yeah, I mean, listen, like as you said, the whole aspect of like what have the stated goals for both the U.S. and Israel been, and have they achieved them, which we'll get into. But in the state of the current ceasefire, the reason why I brought up, the fact that the deadline is approaching is because my concern, and this is based off of just how we've seen Iran and the U.S. negotiate, especially the previous times with Trump, is despite the, I would say, very clear military defeat and disadvantage. I think anyone who's even the most pro-regime, anti-America, anti-Israel, like unless you're being absolutely disingenuous, there's no way to frame that militarily they're utterly defeated. The advantages, disadvantages are heavily tipped in the U.S.-Israeli favor.
Which is what the regime is stating, by the way. They're framing it as an American defeat.
Right, but so like military, like there's little to no pressure because in June, their kind of frame was we destroyed so many buildings in Israel that Israel had to call for a ceasefire because we were destroying them. That's not happening this time. Not that it was happening last time, but they're not even trying to spin that, because despite the fact that all the pressure is on them and they suffered this and continue to suffer this huge military defeat, they negotiate as if they're equals at the table. They drag things off. They really bide their time. They want to come to these pre-negotiations about points, about like the principles of agreement before getting to the agreement itself. And a lot of times it feels like the U.S. is very happy to just kind of drag along. And there's 2 ways this could play out. This could drag on, and then the 2-week ceasefire could turn into a month ceasefire, which could turn out to a 2-month ceasefire because talks are going well. And when talks are quote unquote tending to go well, then it can be extended. On the other hand, the U.S. could do what it did in June, where the 60-day deadline was up, where it's like, this was my deadline, whether I announced officially or not that we're done talking, the deadline was reached, we're going to attack. So we'll see where that's going to go because the deadline is approaching. I feel like at this point it's impossible to gauge because on the one hand, it seems like Trump is fine ending the war and he has a vested interest to get out of it and have oil flowing. He's already said to reporters, like, no matter what happens with the deal, we've already won, which is the kind of messaging of someone who seems disinvested, right? He at least feels comfortable that he could pull a spin. Whereas Netanyahu's messaging has been a bit different. He also says, we've achieved a lot so far. Like, we've already made very notable and respectable achievements, but the work isn't finished. So there's this divide here. And there's also this element of, because the ceasefire was negotiated like strictly just between the U.S. and Iran, whereas it's like obviously Israel coordinated with America before the ceasefire is agreed, but like Israel didn't formally go into the negotiation. So when this ceasefire expires, if it expires, regardless of a deal or not, are we going to see a split where America goes home, but Israel continues?
It's a question many, many people are asking. It's a legitimate question. Most Israelis here, we think the ceasefire won't hold. We assume that at some point very, very soon we'll be back at hostilities, and that's just because we can't really see the talks working out or any form of agreement coming. I mean, Netanyahu and Trump obviously have they've invested very differently in the Iran issue. Netanyahu has been going on about Iran for years. Obviously, June we struck, and then the Americans came in right at the end. This time slightly different, both from the beginning. It was coordinated joint attacks. But Netanyahu, first of all, won't let the Iran issue lie. If the US and Iran come to some sort of agreement and this regime is left in power, whatever Trump says about a new regime, this is not a new regime. This is the same people who were there before. Yeah. These are Islamic Republic people.
I was going to get to that later, but
no, but it depends. So here in Israel, we're expecting hostilities to resume. It also depends, whether you're a realist or an optimist or how you look at things. If you look at it and say, well, the only reason the US got involved was because Trump promised the American people help and said to the Republic, to the Iranian people, said to the Republic, you can't kill your own people. There'll be hell to pay. then did they succeed? Well, not really, because the regime is still in power. As we've just mentioned, they have checkpoints up on the streets. The internet blackout in Iran is now well over 40 days, which is unprecedented in history. An Iranian the other day described it to me as they're basically turning Iran into another North Korea. They're cutting their people off and holding them hostage, which is true. I had a message just this morning from Tehran, from somebody in Tehran, who said if Trump and the Iranians come to a deal, it's the sacrifice of the Iranian people, which, it's easy for us to write about in the paper, which we've said. We've also come up with that. We've also stated that opinion that if, Trump sits down with the regime and they come to sort of deal, it's the Iranian people who will suffer the repression of the regime. It's the Iranian people who are going to suffer again. And we saw how many were slaughtered in January. So the Iranians themselves are sat there looking, going, why have you guys stopped? Why are you sitting with the same people that
it's
slaughtered as a massacre?
It's like a completely separate issue that almost seemed to have been usurped by like the nuclear and ballistic missile issue. Like this all, if we're going to be quaint, right? Like this all started basically from the end of December with the protests.
That's how it was framed.
The preceded massacre of tens of thousands of Iranians protesting, and that was, in the headlines for a good 5 minutes. And then after the strikes started, like, I feel like no one's talking about it, like outside of Iran. No one's really talking about it because the focus has been on the war itself and the goals of the war. So hypothetically, let's say, Trump gets the best deal possible. Iran won't enrich uranium, promises never to have a nuclear weapon, and there's this imaginary perfect mechanism to even enforce it, right? Let's say. Mm-hmm. And I'll even throw in like reduced ballistic missile capability and production on top, because why not? The regime still is repressing its people. It still has no water, no electricity, all these issues.
Everything
not
that
addressing.
Was there was
Nothing changes with the inclusion of a deal. So then, like, what happens in Iran next?
I mean, this is the great unknown. The question is, and we've heard so many mixed reports about, the US at the beginning of the campaign tried to arm the Iranians with weapons and Starlinks, and they were stolen by certain elements of society. Which we don't need to go into, but basically, there are all these rumors going around or reports that such things has happened. Again, one of the stated military goals, certainly by Israel, was to aid the Iranian people, that they can bring about regime change.
Right.
Regime change was not going to come from the air, just from bombs falling. What we were trying to do was give the people who have been taken to the streets the conditions where they can take it up. Now, do those conditions still exist? Potentially. I mean, we know that...
I mean, the bigger question is, did they ever? Because the hard thing for me to discern is, like, we hear about the strikes on these military facilities in Iran and how many IRGC members were killed and all these senior officials were killed. But it's hard to get like a full picture of on the ground, literally.
Well, it's completely difficult because the people can't speak because the internet's been shut off and the regime lies and lies and lies.
Exactly. So I don't know how much, like, I don't know how many, IRGC facilities are still operational. And if there was some kind of armed resistance, what are the chances of it succeeding?
The big picture is we know that we can strike them. We know that our intelligence has once again proved in the first few days of the war, just the leaders that we struck has been phenomenal again. We gave the Iranian people massive hope. They're not going to stop protesting. I don't think, they're not going to turn around if there's a deal or the ceasefire drags on. They're not going to sit there and say, well, that's fine then, the regime's hanging around.
No, they're not going to accept
get on with life. They won't accept that. So the conditions are still there within Iran for the people to rise up. Like you said, the financial situation still exists. The environmental situation still exists. The groundwork is all still there. It's just a question of, can they do it without thousands upon thousands upon thousands being slaughtered again?
Right.
And we'll have to wait and see what happens. It's a great unknown. At the moment, they're very, very disappointed, obviously, as I said, that the Americans are sitting with the Iranian regime. To them, it's the same regime, it's the same people as we just mentioned. It's not any different. However, President Trump wants to frame it. But again, then you say, well, what are the American goals? If the Americans are happy to walk away with reduced uranium enrichment and reduced missile capacity and all these different points on the checklist, that's the American prerogative. We've seen Trump do this before. They sat down for talks before the war even began.
Right.
And most people said, this is just Trump buying time. They're moving troops. They're moving, naval forces, that kind of thing. So we've seen this before. The honest answer is we don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But the Iranian people right now are on the front line to suffer the brunt of the revenge of the regime. And it's a very dangerous position for them to be in. You know, many of them still don't leave their houses; they stay inside. The situation is getting worse and worse, and there's no way for them to contact loved ones. Again, if I may, I spoke to an Iranian a couple of days ago who said to me very bluntly that because of the internet blackout, he has no idea if his mum and sister are still alive or they've been arrested. You know, this is their reality. I think a lot of people in Israel, America, and the wider world forget that this is what the people are going through. And if in any way, shape or form that we've managed to help speed up the process, whatever it is, to helping them take their future into their own hands, then it's a positive thing. If nothing changes and we go back to the status quo, the way things were, and we all have to live with the Islamic Republic, you know, hiding in the background, threatening us, then it won't be considered a success, in my opinion.
So that's actually my biggest concern, because I don't know if this makes me a pessimist or whatever, but I've never really truly been convinced that a deal is achievable that will really make these guarantees that Israel truly feels comfortable with. Because, you know, as Israel, we're in the splash zone, so
Israel knows the Iranian regime. You know, Israel has been sat
Right.
a lot closer geographically than the Americans,
course.
watching
So-
the regime for 5 decades,
Yeah.
going, you know,
we're down the barrel. Yeah. Personally, I've almost like kind of written off what ends up happening with an agreement, because any way this agreement could go is never going to fully be like this kind of like security type of fruition that we really need. But when I think about how Iran is negotiating and what a post agreement Iran will look like, that's my concern, because I see the way that Iran is negotiating now. They're negotiating as if, you know, they have America and Israel by the balls, so to say. So what that signals to me is that the regime, despite all of its losses, despite all of the leaders being killed, despite the, you know, the quick and efficient military defeat, they feel just as comfortable, just as not threatened by the U.S. and Israel. And the reason why I think that's a problem is because when we look back at how this all started, this started at American threats to Iran to stop executions. And then Trump said they promised they'll stop doing it, so it's great. But this is after tens of thousands of people have already been killed. Mm-hmm. So the fact that the regime still feels comfortable and the sense of normalcy, like nothing's really changed, signals to me that when we all go, if, you know, we all go our separate ways, there's an agreement, Americans go back to America, withdraw the forces, Israel stops striking, and Iran is left to its own devices, there's nothing stopping them. They're not afraid of their people. They're not afraid of the conditions in which they're in. They still feel like they're on top of the world. And I see that as like the most unfortunate outcome that seems preventable, because we keep hearing, you know, Iran is at its weakest militarily and like popularity wise. And I think the like failure to capitalize on that and then to let Iran go back to suppressing its own civilians is just like the worst outcome of given how this conflict started.
It would be a huge mistake.
Yeah.
It would be a huge mistake. And as I said, it's the fear of the Iranian people that this is what's going to happen. But
it's my fear that it's like there isn't a single there's nothing in the talks about the people. The U.S. was able to threaten back in December or January, stop killing people we're going to attack. But now there's no assurances that they're going to stop like executions. Like if there are executions, there's no framework where like if you execute people in this time, like we're just going to attack again, like something like that. Like it feels like we're setting up the people of Iran to just be left out to dry. Like it's
certainly the way it looks, and it's certainly the way they feel. I mean, we'll have to see what happens. It could just be yet again that maybe both sides are going into talks knowing that it's going to fail, that they're not going to get anywhere. It could be that they're more optimistic. We'll have to see. Obviously, the Iranian regime has a lot more to gain than the Americans. From this. Their survival depends on this.
Yeah.
So.
And again, it's impossible to tell. And at the same time, the IDF is like fully prepared for negotiations to fall apart any second and to go back to fighting. But yeah, that is the kind of thing we'll have to wait and see. I just have to say that when I look at the status of how things are going and the messaging, and that the bucket is kind of just being kicked down without any real concrete concessions or anything going, it fills me with a lot of dread at this point in time. I'm not optimistic of the talks. Even if it ends in an agreement, I think the end result is a little bleak.
I agree 100%. I think an agreement would be the worst thing possible.
Yeah. So that being said, if we go back a bit, because now we're in this very rare period of time where there's actual relative calm. Obviously, if you include the north of Israel, that doesn't count because, you know, war with Hezbollah is just, you know,
perpetual.
Yeah, gone up to 11. But for the most part, the country's actually in relative calm. So we have this like small window of time before everything goes to hell again that we can just kind of digest and really talk about like how how the war has gone. So if you look at, Trump and Netanyahu's claims about achieving victory, the question remains, did we? And it obviously depends on framing, but like genuinely, I don't know. Me personally, and this is just my opinion, you don't have to agree with it, but from the first day of when these strikes occurred, in addition to the confusion and the fear and having to run into the shelter 9 times that day and all that stuff, I was just very confused about if we're doing this again on our own terms, and like what did we do in June, or did we really achieve as much in June as we said we did?
There's been so much mixed messaging behind that.
Yeah.
There were reports coming after June of, X percent, Y percent of the ballistic missiles have been destroyed, and then, February, March, April come around, and it's like, oh, actually, now we've destroyed 70%.
Right.
Nobody quite knows what to believe. A lot of it is propaganda. Like we said, the Iranian side, it's not like there's independent reporting coming from inside Iran. The people can't speak. So the only thing you kind of have to go on is the state media, the regime's media itself. So everything is sort of half in the light, half in the dark. Was it a success? Well, I mean,
I don't want to downplay the strikes on the nuclear facilities, like, and how far that was set back. I'm not saying June was a complete failure. That's not my intention. But I think we were kind of sold at the beginning, at the end of the 12-day war in June, that like this was this resounding success, and then really slowly went back to, oh, by the way, there might still be a ballistic threat, to our eyes are always on a ballistic threat, to now we have to deal with it. And in both times we were told, 90% of the launchers were destroyed. We destroyed this significant amount of their missiles. But at the same time, you still have millions of Israelis going into shelters every day because of fire from Iran. They've now started using cluster bombs almost exclusively. And, not that the country's being destroyed, but they do successfully go through and do like some damage.
Absolutely.
So,
people have died. Let's
listen,
not forget, people have died.
Yeah, listen, there are people not connected to reality on Twitter who are convinced that Tel Aviv is destroyed. But like, I'm not talking about that. But like, the point is like, they did adapt their strategy. It did continue to cause. So like the threat isn't suppressed, and our military correspondent Yonah Jeremy Bob writes all these analyses about how we're not actually sure how much of Iran's missiles are destroyed. So I'm just what.
Well, it depends. If you go through the checklist, sort of what, let's break it down to mini goals, shall we say? So, once again, similar to June, very, very quickly, we had complete control over Iranian airspace.
Yeah.
That's an objective completed.
Yeah.
A very good one. I was thinking about this the other day, that obviously we had hundreds and hundreds of missiles flying at Israel, but there was not one Iranian jet that could come anywhere near our borders because airfields are destroyed, the Air Force is in ruins. So,
and very quickly, the amount of missiles per barrage, the first day they would send like 100, and then it just went down to 1.
Went down. I mean, the other side of it is, from a negative side, people have died, people have lost their homes, people have suffered trauma. We've all gone through a lot over 6 weeks. The other flip side is, you could say, after 5 decades of taking their nation's wealth and investing it in their arms program and supporting all these proxies,
what do they have to show
5
for
decades,
it? Yeah.
this is the worst the Islamic Republic can throw at us. Which sounds, it might sound crude, as I say, people have died, but like, considering they were the nuclear threat hiding behind the wall, after 5 decades of building up their arms, or 4 decades, because we'll let them off the 80s, they were fighting the Iraqis, but this is it. This is the Islamic Republic's big threat. That, I mean, it's awful, but we have to run to bomb shelters at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. This is, I mean, if this is, as everybody kept, claiming, this is the start of World War III.
And again, like, this isn't from I'm not trying to paint this picture that like we haven't accomplished anything, because a lot of this does come from successful ability to reduce their capability. It's very similar to like Hezbollah. Like the IDF had this huge assessment that if Hezbollah ever really went all out, tens of thousands of buildings all over like the center would just be destroyed, and we would be under fire.
But at the same time, you'll hear conflicting reports that after the Beeper report, and because Iran is so busy, fighting the Americans and the Israelis and dealing with Hormuz and all these different things, that, not that they've abandoned Hezbollah, but the funding has been cut and all these different problems.
It's like what they have managed to do compared to what the expectation of like the worst case scenario, it falls flat. Like it was severely crippled. So I think for sure that's a point. And again, I think, in a normal country, maybe this quote unquote new leadership would be like, wow, we invested 5 decades into destroying Israel, and the best we got was, we killed 40 civilians and cluster bombed some buildings. I think maybe we should, have a new venture. But I doubt that's going to happen. But my bigger question here is that how does this resolve, or is Iran just going to be another permanent front? Are we just going to mow the grass every few months? If we don't know how many missiles they have, but anytime we think there's an imminent threat, we're just going to open up on a operation to establish air dominance and freely strike whatever we want, and then say it's calm for now. Is this going to be the new reality? Like,
I don't think so. I don't think we're going to be going through this sort of cycle every 6 months to a year. Personally, I think, well, on a personal level, I think at some point the Iranian people will once again take to the streets, be it because there's calm, there are no more bombs falling, or situation deteriorates even further, or we go back to war and Israel and the US decimate the regime even more, and that
Right.
then provides the conditions for the people.
Or
to
a combination of all of those. But
Exactly.
it feels like it has to at some point.
Well, the people, I mean, again, these are unknowns. You could say that similar comparison that I mentioned before is North Korea.
Yeah.
But the North Korean regime has been there for 50 plus years and is showing absolutely no signs of slipping. So
We're having a great time.
So we have no idea genuinely how long these things can go on for. What we do know is, from history, is that revolutions don't happen overnight. The final act,
Right.
that final push may happen, but they take months and months. 79.
Like if we look at Syria, no one thought, analysts were talking about changes in the lines of the opposition by like millimeters. Like, the opposition managed to move forward just this tiny little bit, and then all of a sudden one day it was over. But
Look at 79 in Iran. There was all of 78 saw protests and deaths and violence as the people were taken to the streets to protest the Shah. So it took a whole year before the regime actually fell. So considering December 28th, actual protests began, not just isolated pockets against the regime, but
For sure.
genuine, Tehran bazaar closed down and the people took to the streets. That's only a few months ago.
Right.
These things do take time. The people have been seeing missiles, but I think everything, we have to see what happens with the talks. We have to see what happens with the Iranian people. There are so many unknowns in this that it's just impossible to predict what is going to happen.
I think the other worrying, so the thing that really casts doubt, because I'm kind of convinced based on the conditions in which this operation started, can easily be replicated. As in, I could see it's very easy for Israel to justify opening another strike on Iran based on what they did this time, because I think the bar wasn't that high, and I don't think
there'd have to be a reason for it.
It would have to be
it couldn't just be a resumption, because there has to be a point to it. We can't just, oh, we're bored, let's go back to bombing Iran.
I'm not saying there wouldn't be a point. What I'm saying is, like, if there is a point, and that point could be many things that I expect the regime to do, like continue produce missiles, not cooperate with any kind of nuclear framework anyway. Like, I think if there's even wind that Iran is hiding something from inspectors, that would be grounds to attack again. But there's also, we can't forget that while Iran has been in, the limelight, there are still multiple fronts that Israel is dealing with. Like Gaza, we haven't talked about for such a long time, but like that is not developing in a good way. Hamas is being very, they're being very.
They're going about their business quietly.
Same with they're being very openly not happy about the idea of disarming, even though this is something that has been agreed upon months ago, and now we're kind of hitting this roadblock. So we're so not out of the woods in so many aspects. Hezbollah, which we haven't really dove into, it's essentially a war of its own at this point. We're like, Israel is deep in South Lebanon, and the IDF is stating, we have these big goals that we really need to defang Hezbollah. This comes in tandem with Israel-Lebanon talks, which again we'll also have to see how that develops. But I am less optimistic that Lebanon really can enforce what we would love them to enforce. And because there is this riffraff about is Hezbollah or is Lebanon included in the ceasefire, and we're continuing to attack Lebanon, and Iran threatening to strike Israel if Israel continues to strike Lebanon, and it doesn't seem like Israel's going to stop striking Lebanon, is that going to be grounds for renewed hostilities? Like, there's so much there's so many factors that are intertwined one to another that I can just see Israeli Iranian aggression coming back in a heartbeat. Like it's just
Some people would welcome that because we've already proven that militarily I think it's fair to say we have supremacy over the Iranians.
yeah,
We can take control of the skies and we can kind of do what we want at will. The main point there is it's important to remember that Hezbollah and Hamas are obviously so tied in
right.
to the Iranian regime. You know, people talk about the octopus with its tentacles. Well, we're going for the main body of the octopus, aren't we?
Yeah,
Which has weakened the tentacles. You know, Hezbollah, as we said, are not in a position that they have been, you know, even just a few years ago. Even though they're still firing missiles, you know, war is difficult. It's hard to win a war. And it's the same with Hamas. Listen, I think in terms of the Gaza situation, number one is everything changed once we got the last hostage back. Once Rangvili's body was returned to Israel, the whole mentality changed because it wasn't like we needed to be there in the ground searching for hostages. So
right.
that automatically removed one objective that changed the battlefield slightly. So that changed it in the first place. Then, because we've been dealing with Iran, obviously Gaza has taken less manpower, it's taken less strength. Our focus has been on everything happening in Iran and happening up north. I'm sure the Hamas-Gaza situation will rear its head once again very soon. We'll have to deal with it. You know, nobody's saying that war is finished, but I think given the pressing hostage situation has been dealt with and the imminent rocket threat to the south has been dealt with, and the fact that we're busy dealing with other problems in and of itself shows that we can just sort of keep an eye on it, and I will come back to that problem. You know, we'll cross that bridge as and when it's needed.
That's the thing that interests me, though. It's that we have, you know, we kind of have a bunch of things on a bunch of different hubs, and we're dealing with the most pressing.
But it's always like that in Israel. No, this is multi-front war. Unfortunately, this is why we keep an eye on our neighbors.
But that's precisely why I'm curious how this Iran, like, what conflict with Iran is going to look like, because you're not convinced that it's going to become a regular front.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if I'm so convinced. I don't mean as regular as Hezbollah or Hamas, like for sure not. You know, if we look at the gap between June and now, it was like 8.5 months. But
well, I'm convinced of it, by the way, because I'm convinced, my personal opinion, I'm convinced that the regime will fall. There are many, many people out there who don't think the regime will fall.
Listen, I do think ultimately the regime will fall, but for me, I think it's a matter of until it does, I don't see repeated mowing the grass in Iran as an option that's off the table. It seems to me like that's one that Israel is very comfortable with. It's kind of like I think Israel really tries to instill kind of like this blanket version of like the Dakhia doctrine, where like we're going to defend ourselves even if it's preemptively, even if it's against Iran, or even if it's right in our backyard. But I think the bottom line here is like based off of what I've seen and what I've read and the messaging versus like the military action, I'm not convinced that until the regime falls that this is our last round with Iran.
Oh,
even if an agreement is
nobody's
reached.
Convinced of that. No, for sure. So many people agree with you. As we open our conversation with, so many people think within a matter of weeks we'll be back at sort of some form of war with Iran. So no, it's definitely. And listen, until the regime falls, they'll still be there to deal with in whatever sense,
right.
Whether it's bombing a nuclear facility or striking IRGC checkpoints or just a proxy war from afar. Whatever it is, as long as the regime falls, there will be some form of conflict. Now, obviously, since June, it has been elevated to direct, nation-to-nation conflict. It's up to the ante. But, yeah, no, it wouldn't surprise anybody if we end up going for another round. What I don't think is that it's sort of going to go on for years and years and years, and that once a year we'll pop over to Tehran, bomb a few sites, and come back.
I don't think it's going to become like a new Gaza, where every few years we have an operation, whatever. But what concerns me, or at least what I'm like, I guess coming to terms with, is that it would, this would change the reality of just living day to day in Israel. It does take a huge toll on Israel. Not like there's the economy side of it, like the government is like shelling out millions of shekels literally just in reimbursements for people who are having their stuff destroyed. A lot of the country has to call up to reserves, even more than they already have been after 2.5 years of war. My wife spent the whole 6 weeks, she's in like search and rescue. So she was just responding to destroyed buildings. After all of the reserve duty that she already did. Also threw a wrench in our honeymoon, but that's besides the point. I'll let it slide. But there is a toll here in many different facets on what life in Israel means when you're at war with Iran specifically, and not just any other of these terror regimes. And so the fact that it could become a more frequent thing in any capacity is, it's kind of like a hard pill to swallow. It's like, how do you just kind of accept that, because it sucks, you know what I mean?
It's the famous Israeli resilience.
Yeah, but I think it's also why we're so desperate to figure out what exactly, what are we doing.
I agree, and again, it's one of those unknowns that just.
And again, I'm convinced that whatever it is that we're trying to achieve, we're definitely getting close to it. We definitely have military superiority or whatever around. We're not I don't really think we're so much at threat, because Israel's doing such a great job neutralizing it, for sure. But it's just the resilience is, it's really put under strain when you have to go through it so much, and the messaging is just whack. It's so bad. Israel saying one thing, America saying another thing, Pakistan is keeping its mouth shut. Which this is kind of a side point, but I also talked about this during the negotiations with Hamas, that I think mediators need to do a very better job of just clearly saying what are actually the terms. How can it be that one side is saying this is included, another side is saying this is not included, and they're just keeping it quiet? It's you're supposed to be.
It's the great game of geopolitics.
It drives me crazy. I feel like I'm being gaslit. I just don't.
I listen. We're all, as you. I'm sure people can see that we're all exhausted.
Yeah.
After 6 weeks, one thing that we had to deal with was, I think it's very hard when you're in a war like this, where there's two nations against another, but only one of the two nations is actually being shot at, has missile.
Yeah.
I know American servicemen lost their lives and stuff, but
it does also have to be noted that also, all of the Gulf states.
100%. Oh no, listen.
The UAE has been getting pelted.
So many people across the region have sort of come to a realization of, wow, this is what Israelis have been going through for decades. And we've had messages like that, expressing sort of solidarity. We had no idea this is what your life was like.
This sucks, yeah.
Listen, it's exhausting, it's tiring. Everybody is PTSD'd out and trauma and the whole caboodle. But most people, and the polls I think back this up, most people supported definitely military action if it would help bring about regime change. We understand that getting rid of Iran is a domino that affects so much in the region, as we've just mentioned, things like Gaza and Hezbollah and Lebanon and all these different aspects in Syria. So it is the octopus that we need to deal with. And talks, whether they happen again, whether they succeed again, we've already reached the top of the mountain. We're at the peak.
Right.
In terms of, this is the second time we're at conflict, and all the points that we've just brought in, there's no going back from this. Whatever happens, there's no going back to how things were during the 90s or the 2000s or the 2010s. Things have changed completely. We also, people will be aware there's only a couple of years left of Trump's second term. We don't know what's going to happen, who the next US administration is going to be. They may have a completely different approach to Iran, similar to the Biden-Harris administration, which, from an Israeli perspective, was absolutely catastrophic.
Right.
Don't. What kind of a message is that? Whereas we're sat here going, we're going to bomb you.
Right.
So all of this comes into play. Bibi will be sat there. He's got an election in October. There's so many different facets that come into play. We have to see what happens. I mean, in the short term, we'll have to see what happens in the second round of talks in Islamabad. But this is nowhere near over, and we know that. This is nowhere near over. We're well versed and well prepared, and running to bomb shelters, sleeping in the mamad, sleeping in the safe room. But I think most Israelis sit there and say, if this brings about regime change, then we're willing to stick through it.
I think it's more than that. It's that ultimately this has to. We're happy to stay along for the ride, but
or it'll just be a cycle.
This can't just become the status quo, where it's just renewed aggression and then things calm down. There has to be this resolution. It's funny because I remember obviously, over this past month and a half or whatever, I've been exhausted, especially covering the news and every 5 minutes having to cover literally everything happens is just, I still felt fatigue from the last Iran war, and then this happened, so I'm like double, but then once the ceasefire was announced, I was kind of like, oh, but
Many people,
we're not done.
many people were.
So it's just such an interesting, like, it's this paradox where it's like, I hate being in Israel during war because it's so exhausting. It's like, it's got to the point where, like, I was imagining alarms. Like, I would wake myself up because I convinced myself that I heard the pre-warning, and then I would check my phone and there wasn't one, which sucks because I just ruined my chance at,
I think that's called PTSD.
sleep. Probably should talk to somebody about that. But at the same time, it's like, the job isn't done.
Well, that's what I mean. The Iranian people themselves are disappointed. Most Israelis are disappointed. But I don't think also, like we've said, deep down, I don't think anybody believes this is over, that they're going to come to some sort of agreement. Nobody's believing that. We have to see what the American plans are, because that's the great unknown. We don't know what Trump is thinking.
This is a whole separate episode, but like we could talk about domestically in America, the feelings of the war. Not great. Regardless of how it's spun, but like that's a huge factor because,
It all is. It all is. And I guess we'll just have to see what happens in the coming days. Hopefully soon you'll be able to have a honeymoon, maybe even in Tehran if things go the way.
Wow, God willing, yeah.
If things go the way they're supposed to go. But yeah, we'll have to see. It's been a hectic few weeks. It's been great catching up with you.
Yeah.
And
I hope we can get, squeeze at least one more episode in the podcast before everything goes to hell again. But
I'm sure we will.
Yeah.
But yeah, the problem is it's easy in the news to report on things that have already happened.
Yeah.
Predicting what is going to happen.
For sure. But, as we said at the beginning, the deadline is coming up. So I think, we'll be having more of these conversations very, very soon.
I hope so.
That's all we have for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. It was a pleasure to be back. Hopefully the quiet will last long enough to get another one in the studio. Only time will tell. Until then, stay up to date on the latest on Israel and the Iran war at jpost.com.